Western Nebraska. Late October, 1887. Sarah Caldwell was digging a hole beneath her cabin, and every neighbor within 2 miles thought she'd lost her mind. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter. Something else entirely. A space carved into the earth directly under her floorboards, accessed through a crude trapdoor in her kitchen. She'd been at it for 3 weeks, hauling buckets of clay soil, reinforcing walls with scrap lumber, creating what looked like a grave beneath her own home. Burying her firewood before winter, one farmer muttered. That woman's desperation has turned to madness. But Sarah Caldwell wasn't mad. She was solving a problem that had killed her husband the previous winter. A problem so common, so brutally simple, that everyone accepted it as inevitable. Wet firewood that wouldn't burn. What she understood, and what her neighbors would discover only when the coldest months arrived, would change how every homesteader in the county stored their fuel. If you want to see frontier ingenuity that still works today, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you survival techniques that were proven when lives depended on them. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. This is the story of a solution born from necessity, mocked into silence, and vindicated by the one judge that never lies, a brutal plains winter. Sarah Caldwell hadn't chosen to become an expert on firewood. The choice had been made for her on February 9th, 1887, when her husband Jacob collapsed while splitting frozen oak in sub-zero wind. Heart failure, the doctor said. Overexertion in extreme cold. But Sarah knew the real killer. Their wood pile had gotten soaked during a January thaw, then frozen solid. Jacob had spent 3 desperate days trying to split ice-encased logs with a dull axe, burning through their stored kindling just to dry enough fuel to keep the stove alive. The physical strain, the sleepless nights, the constant worry, it had broken something in his chest that couldn't be repaired. Now, 8 months later, she faced the same problem alone. A widow at 34, with 2 children, Emma, age 9, and Samuel, age 6, and a homestead claim that would revert to the government if she abandoned it. No family within 200 miles. No money for hired help. Just 160 acres of prairie, a drafty cabin, and the knowledge that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. The wood pile sat 20 yards from her door, same as every neighbor's, a rectangular stack of split cottonwood and ash, covered with a canvas tarp weighted down by rocks. Standard frontier practice. It looked sufficient. 8 cords, enough to burn from November through March if she was careful. But Sarah had learned what the tarp couldn't do. It kept snow off the top, sure, but wind-driven moisture crept in from the sides. Rain pooled underneath. Morning frost penetrated the entire stack. By midwinter, the outer 2 feet of every pile in the county would be a frozen, useless mass. You'd burn 3 logs to dry 1 log enough to burn properly. Chimneys choked with creosote. Cabins filled with smoke. Temperatures inside barely reached 50 degrees, even with the stove roaring constantly. And if the wood got truly soaked, as it had last January during that week of freezing rain, you could die trying to keep warm. Sarah spent September thinking. She couldn't build a proper wood shed. Lumber was expensive, and she lacked the carpentry skills. She couldn't move the pile indoors. Her cabin was barely 12 by 16 feet, already crammed with beds, a table, storage trunks, and a cast-iron stove that dominated one corner. The solution came to her while sweeping the floor in early October. Heat rising from the stove, warmth collecting near the ceiling, the constant draft of cold air seeping up through gaps in the floorboards, air moving from somewhere below. Her cabin sat on a foundation of stacked fieldstone, elevated 18 inches above grade to prevent floor rot. The crawl space beneath was just dirt and darkness, and used, inaccessible except where skirting boards had rotted away. But it was there, and it was dry, protected by the cabin's overhang, insulated by the earth itself, and warmed by radiant heat escaping through the floorboards. What if she deepened part of that crawl space, created a pit directly under the kitchen, where the stove's heat was strongest, made it just large enough to store 2 or 3 cords, enough to rotate through while keeping the main pile outside as reserve? It sounded insane even in her own mind. Digging under your own house, weakening the foundation, creating a damp hole that might collapse, might flood, might breed mold or attract vermin. But the alternative was another winter like the last one. And Sarah had no intention of dying because she was afraid to try something that looked foolish. On October 12th, she borrowed a pickaxe from her nearest neighbor, Grace Merrick, who lived a mile east. "What on earth do you need this for?" Grace asked, suspicious. "Foundation repair," Sarah lied. "Some settling near the stove." Grace handed over the tool, but watched Sarah walk away with the expression of someone who just enabled a bad decision. 3 days later, Sarah had removed enough floorboards to create a working access, a square opening 2 feet wide, just behind the stove. She dropped through with a lantern and began to dig. The dugout took shape over 18 days of brutal, solitary labor. Sarah worked in the mornings while the children were at the schoolhouse 3 miles away, and again in the evenings after they'd gone to sleep. She dug with the pickaxe, hauled soil up in a canvas bucket, dumped it in a growing mound behind the cabin. The space beneath the floor was cramped. She worked on her knees, sometimes on her belly, scraping clay and rock by lantern light. She went down 4 feet. Not because she calculated it, but because 4 feet felt right, deep enough that the Earth's constant temperature would stabilize the air, shallow enough that she wouldn't hit groundwater. The pit measured roughly 6 feet long by 4 feet wide, positioned directly beneath where the stove sat above. She left the original stone foundation intact along the cabin's perimeter, digging only in the interior space where no structural load was carried. The wall she reinforced with scrap lumber, old fence boards, broken crate slats, anything she could scavenge. Not a proper timber frame, just vertical supports wedged into the clay to prevent collapse. She left gaps between the boards for air movement, understanding instinctively what she couldn't have named passive ventilation. Moisture needed somewhere to go. For access, she built a simple ladder, 7 rungs nailed to 2 vertical posts, and hinged the trapdoor above with leather straps salvaged from an old harness. The door itself was 2 floorboards she'd removed, fitted back together, and edged with wool scraps to seal against drafts when closed. The technical brilliance, though she'd never have called it that, was in what she didn't do. She didn't seal the space completely. She didn't line it with stone or brick. She didn't try to make it airtight. Instead, she created what engineers would later call a tempered earth shelter, a semi-enclosed space where 3 factors work together. First, thermal mass. 4 feet of earth on all sides held a stable temperature, around 45 to 50 degrees year-round in that climate, well above freezing but cool enough to prevent rot. Second, radiant heat transfer. The cabin's floor, warmed by the stove above, radiated gentle heat downward. Not enough to make the dugout warm, but enough to keep it 5 to 10 degrees above the surrounding soil temperature. Third, passive airflow. Small gaps in the floorboards and between the wall supports created slow, constant air movement, enough to prevent stagnant humidity, but not enough to chill the space with outside air. The result was an environment perfectly suited for one purpose: keeping split firewood dry. But to her neighbors, it looked like a woman wasting 3 weeks digging a hole that would probably cave in by Christmas. Grace Merrick came by on October 28th with a basket of bread and found Sarah emerging from the trapdoor, covered in clay dust, face smudged with soot from a lantern. "Dear God, Sarah, what have you done to your floor?" "Made some storage," Sarah said, brushing dirt from her skirt. Grace peered into the opening, saw the ladder descending into darkness. "Storage for what?" "Firewood." Grace went silent for a moment. "Then you're storing firewood in a hole under your house." "That's right." "Sarah." Grace's voice carried the careful tone people use with those who've stopped making sense. "Wood needs to breathe. You bury it like that, it'll mildew. Rot. You'll have mushrooms growing through your floor by spring." "It's not buried," Sarah said. "It's sheltered. It's madness." Grace set the bread on the table and backed toward the door. "You've been alone too long. This isn't healthy thinking." After Grace left, Sarah stood at the window and watched her neighbor hurry down the road, glancing back twice as if expecting the cabin to collapse. Sarah didn't blame her. It did look insane. But on November 3rd, When the first snow began to fall, Sarah climbed down into her dugout with an armload of split ash and stacked it against the east wall. The wood was dry. The air was cool, but not cold. No moisture on the walls. No smell of mold. She added more the next day, and the day after that. By mid-November, she had 2 full cords stored below, enough to last 6 weeks if she burned conservatively. Outside, her main pile sat under its tarp, already collecting the frost and wind-blown snow that would, by January, turn into the same frozen mass that killed her husband. But Sarah Caldwell had a secret reserve, and winter was about to teach the county why that mattered. Word traveled fast in a sparse community where every unusual action was news. By late November, Sarah's buried wood cellar was the subject of conversation at the general store, the church, and every cabin gathering within 10 miles. The story had grown in the telling. Some claimed she'd dug 6 feet down. Others said she'd undermined the entire cabin. A few swore she was planning to live in the hole herself when the real cold came. The mockery wasn't cruel, exactly. It was the gentle ridicule reserved for those who've clearly made a poor decision but haven't suffered the consequences yet. People felt sorry for her. They worried, and they talked. Caldwell's widow has gone peculiar, said Martin Hayes, a homesteader who'd been in the county 8 years and considered himself an authority on frontier common sense. He was holding court at Dunphy's General Store on November 19th, surrounded by a half-dozen men picking up supplies before the serious winter set in. Peculiar how? Asked Robert Dunphy, the store owner. Dug herself a pit under the cabin. Claims it's for firewood storage. The men exchanged glances. One of them, Edward Lassiter, a carpenter and occasional builder, shook his head slowly. Under the cabin? She undermining the foundation. Appears so. Grace Merrick saw it. Says there's a hole in the woman's kitchen floor big enough to drop a cow through. That's a structural disaster waiting to happen, Lassiter said with the confidence of a man who'd built 4 houses and never lost one to foundation failure. You don't excavate beneath a load-bearing structure. First heavy snow, that floor is coming down. And even if it doesn't collapse, she's created a moisture trap. That space will turn into a sump. Wood'll rot, floor'll rot. By spring, she'll have a cabin you couldn't give away. Someone should talk to her, said another man. Grace tried, Martin said. Woman wouldn't listen. Said the wood needs to be sheltered. He pronounced the word with exaggerated care, as if it were a symptom of delusion. Wood needs to be stacked and covered, Lassiter said. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. You can't improve on what works. Maybe she's planning to move back east, Robert suggested. Giving up the claim. Doing strange things because she knows she won't be here to face the consequences. Could be, Martin agreed. Shame, really. Jacob was a solid man. But a woman alone, he shrugged. It's hard. Some can manage, some can't. The conversation moved on to other topics, but the judgment had been rendered. Sarah Caldwell was either desperate, incompetent, or losing her grip on practical reality. In any case, her experiment would end badly, and by spring everyone would be proven right. The women were kinder, but no less certain. At church on November 24th, the last gathering before Advent, 3 of Sarah's neighbors cornered her after the service with expressions of concerned solidarity. Sarah, dear, said Margaret Finch, a stout woman in her 50s who'd survived 2 husbands and 3 Homestead winters. We've been hearing things. What sort of things? Sarah asked, though she knew. About your project. Under the house. My firewood storage, Sarah said evenly. Yes, that. Margaret glanced at the other women, Grace Merrick and Doherty, seeking support. Sarah, we're only saying this because we care. That kind of excavation, in winter, beneath a structure, it's dangerous. If something goes wrong, if the ground shifts or water seeps in, you and those children could be in real trouble. The ground's stable, Sarah said, and it's staying dry. Dry now, and interjected. But wait until January. Wait until the thaw-freeze cycles start. You'll have water down there, and then ice, and then she stopped, as if the conclusion was too obvious to state. And the wood itself, Grace added, emboldened by group support. Wood needs air, Sarah. Real air, not stale pit air. It'll mildew. You'll end up burning rotten fuel, and breathing the smoke. It's not safe. Sarah looked at the three of them. Women she'd known for years. Women who meant well. Women who were absolutely convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully. "But I've thought this through." "Have you?" Margaret's voice carried a sharper edge now. "Or have you convinced yourself of something because you're trying to avoid spending money on proper shelter?" "Sarah, there's no shame in asking for help. We can organize a work party, build you a real wood shed. I don't need a work party." Sarah's tone was firmer than she'd intended. "I need people to let me manage my own homestead." The conversation ended there, but the damage was done. Sarah walked home alone while the other families clustered together, their glances following her down the road. By December, the story had reached satirical status. Children at the schoolhouse made up a rhyme. Caldwell digs to Chinatown, stores her wood beneath the ground. When the snow comes falling down, Caldwell's house falls down, down, down. Emma came home crying one afternoon after an older boy had chanted it during recess. Sarah held her daughter and said nothing, because what could she say? That the adults were wrong? That her idea would work? She didn't know for certain. She only knew she'd done the best she could with what she had. And as December's cold settled over the plains, as the first real storms began rolling in from the northwest, Sarah climbed down in her dugout each evening and brought up wood that was still, against all predictions, completely dry. The storm arrived on December 19th, 1887. It started as rain, cold, wind-driven rain that fell for 36 hours straight, turning the prairie into a shallow sea of mud and slush. Temperatures hovered just above freezing, warm enough to melt the previous week's snow, cold enough to soak everything that couldn't run or drain. Every exposed wood pile in the county took the hit directly. Tarps sagged under the weight of water, spilled it down the sides, funneled it into the stacks. The outer layers of split logs, representing weeks of labor and at least a third of most families' winter fuel, absorbed moisture like sponges. Then, on December 21st, the temperature dropped. It dropped fast and it dropped hard, from 38 degrees at sunrise to 9 degrees by noon, and still falling. The rain turned to sleet, then to snow. Wind came howling out of the northwest at sustained speeds that bent trees and tore loose anything not anchored. By nightfall, the thermometer outside Dunphy's general store read -4. The county was locked in. For the next 12 days, temperatures never rose above 15 degrees. Most mornings saw readings between -10 and -20. The snow that had fallen during the transition was now frozen concrete. Roads became impassable. Families huddled inside, burning wood continuously, watching their stacks dwindle with increasing anxiety. And the wood itself, the rain-soaked, now frozen wood, became a nightmare to use. Martin Hayes discovered the problem on December 22nd when he tried to split a frozen log and the axe head bounced off like he'd struck stone. The moisture inside the wood had turned to ice, expanding the grain, making it nearly impossible to cut or break. When he finally managed to wedge a piece apart, the interior was glazed with frost. He brought an armful inside anyway. What choice did he have? And stacked it near the stove to thaw. 3 hours later, the logs had thawed enough to burn, but the moisture content was so high they barely caught. His fire sputtered and smoked, producing more creosote than heat. The cabin's interior temperature dropped to 42 degrees despite the stove running constantly. By December 26th, his family was burning through 3 times their normal fuel consumption just to maintain survivable warmth. At that rate, their 8-cord pile would last until mid-February, leaving 6 weeks of winter with no reserve. He wasn't alone. Every family in the area faced the same mathematics. Edward Lassiter, the carpenter who declared Sarah's dugout a structural disaster, was burning green cottonwood by December 28th because his seasoned ash had become unusable. His chimney choked with tar buildup and had to be cleaned twice in 4 days, a dangerous job in sub-zero wind. Grace Merrick's family ran out of dry kindling on December 30th. They spent an entire morning trying to coax wet wood into flame, burning through precious newspaper, old rags, even furniture scraps. When a fire finally caught, It produced so much smoke that her youngest daughter developed a cough that wouldn't stop. The county began to fracture under the strain. Families with larger reserves refused to share, knowing they'd need every log. Those with smaller piles started eyeing their neighbors' stacks. Martin Hayes confronted Edward Lassiter on January 2nd, accusing him of stealing 2 cords during the night, an accusation Lassiter denied but couldn't disprove. Desperation brought out questions no one wanted to ask. What do you burn when the wood runs out? How cold can a cabin get before the risk of death becomes immediate? How do you keep children warm when the stove won't stay lit? And then someone noticed Sarah Caldwell's chimney. It wasn't Doherty who first remarked on it. On January 5th, while struggling through knee-deep snow to check on a neighbor, she paused at the crest of a small rise and looked across the white expanse towards Sarah's cabin, half a mile south. Smoke rose from the chimney, not the thick, black, desperate smoke that choked from most houses, but a thin, steady stream of clean gray. The kind of smoke that comes from dry, well-seasoned wood burning efficiently, and stood there for a full minute, watching. Then she changed course and headed toward the Caldwell homestead. And Doherty knocked on Sarah Caldwell's door at 10:30 on the morning of January 5th, 1888. When Sarah answered, Ann's first impression was disorientation. The cabin was warm. Not the desperate 45 degrees most families were achieving. Not the 50-degree compromise you accepted because anything higher meant burning fuel you'd need later. Warm, genuinely warm. And guessed 65, maybe higher. And Sarah looked surprised, but not unwelcoming. Is everything all right? And hesitated, suddenly aware how strange her visit might seem. I was passing by, saw your smoke, wanted to check that you were managing. Come in, Sarah said, stepping aside, and entered and felt the temperature difference immediately, like stepping from a root cellar into a summer kitchen. The cast-iron stove in the corner radiated steady heat, its surface showing the dull red glow of efficient combustion. No smoke smell, no dampness. The windows had condensation at the edges, sure, but that was normal in winter. Everything else was dry, warm, comfortable. Samuel and Emma sat at the table practicing letters on slate boards, both in normal clothing. No heavy coats, no blankets wrapped around their shoulders like most children wore indoors during January. How are you keeping it this warm? And asked before she could stop herself. Sarah glanced at the stove. Good wood, mostly. Good wood. And repeated. You mean dry wood? Yes. From where? Ann's voice carried more urgency than she'd intended. Your pile's been out in the same weather as everyone else's. How do you have dry wood? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She walked to the table, checked the children's work, then moved to the stove and used an iron hook to adjust a log. The motion was casual, routine, not the desperate management and had been doing at her own house, constantly poking and prodding a fire that refused to burn properly. I stored some differently, Sarah said finally. The dugout. And said it as statement, not question. The hole under the house. You're pulling from there. Yes. And looked at the floor, noticed the trapdoor behind the stove, closed now, flush with the boards, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Can I see it? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She lit a lantern, opened the trapdoor, and descended the ladder, and followed. The space below was exactly as Grace Merrick had described, a rough pit, 4 feet deep, reinforced with scrap lumber. But what Grace hadn't mentioned, what she couldn't have known because she'd only looked at it in October, was what the space had become by January. The walls were dry, completely dry, no frost, no moisture, no sign of the dampness Anne had expected. The temperature was cool, but not cold, and guessed around 50 degrees, warmer than outside by 60 degrees, warmer than most cabins by 5 or 10. And against the east wall, stacked neatly to the ceiling, sat 2 cords of split ash and cottonwood, and approached the pile and touched the nearest log. The bark was dry under her fingers. She picked up a piece and examined it in the lantern light. No frost, no glaze, no moisture. The wood was as dry as if it had been stored in a barn all summer. Ow! And whispered. The earth keeps it stable, Sarah said, and the heat from the stove helps. Not much, but enough. And set the log down and looked around the space again, trying to understand what she was seeing. This violated everything she'd been told about wood storage. Wood needed air circulation. Wood needed exposure. You couldn't keep it sealed away in a hole without inviting rot and mildew. Except Sarah had, and it worked. Have you told anyone? And asked. No one's asked. They'll ask now. And said, once word gets out that you're burning good wood while everyone else is freezing, I'm not interested in word getting out, Sarah said firmly. I'm interested in keeping my children warm. That's all. But, and Doherty was already calculating. Her own family had maybe 3 weeks of marginally usable wood left. Her husband had been talking about burning fence posts. And here was a solution, proven, working right in front of her. Sarah, and said carefully, would you show my husband how you built this? Sarah met her eyes in the lantern light. I thought everyone said it was madness, a structural disaster, doomed to fail. Everyone was wrong. Sarah climbed the ladder without responding, and followed. When they reached the kitchen, Sarah closed the trapdoor and set the lantern aside. Tell your husband to come by tomorrow afternoon, Sarah said. I'll show him what I did. He can decide for himself if it'll work on his place. And left 20 minutes later, walking back through the snow with her mind racing. By that evening, she'd told her husband. By the next morning, he'd told Martin Hayes. By January 7th, 11 families in the county knew that Sarah Caldwell was burning dry wood from a dugout storage pit that shouldn't work but did. Robert Dunphy measured the phenomenon on January 9th. He arrived at Sarah's cabin with a thermometer and a notebook, introduced himself formally, as if they hadn't known each other for 2 years, and asked permission to document the situation. Sarah let him in, showed him the dugout, let him take readings. He spent 40 minutes down there with his lantern and thermometer, emerging with numbers he kept checking as if they might change. Exterior temperature, minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit cabin interior, 67 degrees Fahrenheit dugout interior, 49 degrees Fahrenheit wood moisture content. Estimated by weight comparison less than 20%, he compared those numbers to his own situation. Exterior temperature, minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit, same cabin interior. 48 degrees Fahrenheit wood pile exterior layer. Frozen solid, unusable wood pile interior. After hours of thawing 35 to 40% moisture. Content, you're maintaining 17 degrees warmer inside, while burning roughly. He paused, calculating 40% less wood per day than I am. I haven't measured that precisely, Sarah said. You don't need to. I can see the consumption rate. He gestured toward her outdoor pile, which had barely been touched since December. You're pulling maybe 4 logs a day from storage. I'm burning 12 to 15, and half of them don't want to catch. Robert closed his notebook and looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed respect and embarrassment. Mrs. Caldwell, I believe I owe you an apology. We all do. You don't owe me anything, Sarah said. Nevertheless, he paused at the door. I'll be building one of these under my store, and I suspect you're going to have a lot of visitors in the next few weeks. He was right. By January 15th, 1888, Sarah Caldwell's cabin had become an unofficial gathering place for homesteaders trying to understand what they'd gotten wrong. They came in pairs and small groups, always respectful, often sheepish. Men who dismissed the idea 3 months earlier now stood in Sarah's kitchen asking detailed questions about excavation depth, wall reinforcement, and ventilation gaps. Women who'd worried about her sanity now wanted to know if the technique would work under a summer kitchen, a smokehouse, or a barn. Sarah answered every question with the same patient precision she'd used to build the thing. Practical, specific, unsentimental. She wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. She just wanted people to understand what worked and why. Edward Lassiter, the carpenter who'd called it a structural disaster, was the first to publicly reverse his position. He arrived on January 16th with his son and a notebook, spent 2 hours examining the dugout's construction, and left with sketches and measurements. 3 days later, he began excavating beneath his own cabin, this time with proper timber framing and a reinforced access hatch, improvements on Sarah's original design. I was wrong, he told Martin Hayes bluntly when questioned about the change of heart. The woman understood something I didn't. No shame in learning from that. Martin took longer to come around. His pride had been wounded, not just by being wrong, but by the fact that a widow with no formal training had solved a problem that experienced homesteaders had simply accepted as inevitable. He visited Sarah's place on January 22nd, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but spent 20 minutes examining the dugout entrance and asking questions disguised as skepticism. "How do you know the moisture won't build up over time?" he asked. "I don't know for certain," Sarah admitted. "But it's been 2 months and the wood's still dry. The air circulates enough to prevent stagnation. And if the floor collapses, then I'll have made a mistake. But the joists are sound, and I didn't touch the foundation stones. The load's distributed same as it always was." Martin nodded slowly, said nothing more, and left. 2 weeks later, his eldest son was seen digging a test pit behind their barn. The technique spread not through evangelism, but through quiet, practical adoption. Families modified the design to fit their situations. Some built partial dugouts only 3 feet deep. Others created elongated trenches running the length of their cabins to maximize storage. Robert Dunphy excavated beneath his general store and started offering drywood storage consultation as a side business, charging $2 to help homesteaders plan their own systems. By late February, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some version of Sarah's design. The technique acquired a name. People started calling it Caldwell storage or simply the dugout method, though Sarah herself never claimed ownership. When asked about it, she'd shrug and say it was just common sense applied to an old problem. The real validation came in March, during the spring thaw. This was the moment Doherty had predicted back in November, when the ground would shift, moisture would seep in, and Sarah's foolish hole would flood or collapse. It didn't. The dugouts drained naturally. The earth walls, slightly compacted by winter's freeze-thaw cycles, remained stable. And the wood stored inside, those families who'd built their own versions, emerged bone-dry and ready for the tail end of winter's cold snaps. Edward Lassiter documented the performance in a letter to the county newspaper, published April 3, 1888. This winter proved harder than most, with prolonged cold and moisture that destroyed conventional wood storage across the county. Those families who adopted the subsurface storage method, pioneered by Mrs. Sarah Caldwell of our township, maintained dry fuel throughout the crisis. The technique works. It is safe when properly constructed, and it represents the kind of practical innovation that separates successful homesteading from mere survival. The letter didn't mention his earlier criticism. It didn't need to. Everyone remembered. Sarah kept her dugout in operation for the next 14 years, until her children were grown and she moved to a larger house in town. The new owners of her homestead, a young couple from Ohio, found the storage pit still functional, the walls still dry, the system still doing exactly what Sarah had built it to do. They used it for another 20 years. By 1910, the technique had become standard practice in parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota, passed down as frontier wisdom without most people knowing where it started. Variations appeared in homesteading guides and agricultural bulletins, always with slight modifications, but the same core principle. Use the Earth's stable temperature and your home's waste heat to create a microclimate for fuel storage. The mockery that had followed Sarah in late 1887 was forgotten. What remained was the solution, practical, replicable, proven by the one test that mattered. It worked when lives depended on it. Sarah Caldwell never called herself an engineer. She never wrote a manual or gave a lecture. She simply looked at a problem that was killing people, wet firewood in a brutal climate, and refused to accept it as inevitable. What she understood, and what her educated critics missed, was that innovation doesn't require formal training. It requires observation, willingness to try something that looks foolish, and the courage to ignore mockery when you know you're solving a real problem. The dugout shelter wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. By conventional standards, it was exactly what her neighbors called it, a hole in the ground beneath a house, dug by a desperate woman who didn't know any better. But it worked. And in the end, on the frontier, that was the only standard that mattered. The physics were simple once you saw them. Thermal mass stabilizes temperature. Radiant heat transfers through surfaces. Air circulation prevents moisture buildup. These weren't secrets. They were observable facts that anyone could have noticed if they'd been willing to question the assumption that this is how it's always been done. Sarah questioned that assumption because she had no choice. Her husband was dead. Her children needed heat. And the traditional method, stack it outside, cover it with a tarp, hope for the best, had proven inadequate under real-world conditions. So she dug a hole. And in doing so, she demonstrated a principle that extends far beyond firewood storage. The best solutions often come from the people closest to the problem, not from those with the most credentials. Her neighbors learned that lesson the hard way. They learned it when their woodpiles froze and hers didn't. They learned it when their cabins dropped to 40 degrees and hers stayed at 67. They learned it when the winter that should have broken her instead proved her right. And they learned it quietly, without fanfare, because frontier wisdom doesn't spread through manifestos or proclamations. It spreads through results. Through one neighbor noticing another's smoke rising clean and steady. Through one family realizing they're burning half the wood and staying twice as warm. Through the simple, undeniable fact that something works better than what came before. Today, if you visit the Plains counties of Nebraska, you can still find old homesteads with traces of these dugout storage systems. Depressions in the earth beneath abandoned cabins. Stone-lined pits that once held firewood through winters that tested everything. Most people who see them don't know what they're looking at. They're just holes. Old construction. Frontier oddities. But to those who understand the story, they're monuments to a different kind of intelligence. The intelligence of practical necessity. The courage of unconventional thinking, and the quiet vindication that comes when the world stops laughing and starts learning. Sarah Caldwell dug a hole beneath her house because she refused to freeze. And in doing so, she gave her community and generations after a technique that turned survival into stability. That's not madness. That's wisdom. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? I want to hear your stories of making it through when conditions got brutal. And if you learned something from Sarah's story, if you see how frontier ingenuity still applies to modern problems, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you techniques that were proven when lives actually depended on them. This is practical history. This is survival wisdom that works. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. And remember, sometimes the craziest idea is just the solution no one's tried yet. Educational note. This video presents a historical narrative based on frontier practices and thermal engineering principles. While the core concepts, thermal mass, radiant heat transfer, and earth-sheltered storage, are scientifically sound, any modern application should be designed by qualified professionals and comply with local building codes and safety regulations. This content is educational and historical in nature, not construction advice.